My neighbor gave away my lake to her nephew for free so he could turn it into a luxury resort. Sounds like a bad sitcom, right? Except I was the punchline. I thought buying a lakefront property meant peace, not HOA-powered land theft wrapped in community spirit. One minute I'm fishing off my dock, the next I'm arguing with tourists who think my backyard is their private beach. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that thinks they outrank property deeds, you're gonna feel this one in your soul. Drop a comment if your HOA's ever tried something shady. I might not be alone in this madness. I had just moved from the noisy city life to Willow Creek Ranch subdivision in Montana, completely exhausted from years of urban chaos and ready to start fresh. After saving every penny from my boat repair business, I finally had enough to buy this small wooden house by the lake that seemed like paradise itself. The property wasn't fancy, just a simple 2-bedroom cabin with a workshop space, but it had the one feature that made it worth every dollar: 50 feet of completely private lakefront that belonged entirely to me, according to the deed. I spent my first week setting up my boat repair workshop in the garage and building my own wooden dock with my own hands. That first morning when everything was complete, I sat fishing on my handmade dock with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise reflect off the still water. No car horns blaring, no deadlines breathing down my neck, just the gentle lapping of water against the shore. It was exactly what I'd been searching for after years of saving and dreaming about this moment. That perfect morning tranquility was interrupted when Debbie Langford appeared at my property line like she owned the place. She was a well-dressed woman in her early 40s, wearing a bright yellow sundress and carrying a clipboard and measuring tape that immediately put me on edge. Debbie introduced herself as the HOA chairwoman with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, which were busy scanning and evaluating every detail of my property setup. She complimented my house enthusiastically, but I could tell she was really focused on the lakefront area, her gaze lingering on the dock I'd built and the clear property lines marked by my fence. "This is such a beautiful setup you have here," she said, but there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't entirely pleased about it. "Especially this lakefront area. What an incredible view." She began making what she called friendly suggestions, but they didn't sound quite so friendly when you listened carefully. "You know, Eli, this fence right by the lake creates a bit of a barrier for the community. We've always been big on sharing the natural beauty around here." She gestured toward my fence with her measuring tape. "If you considered removing this fence section, everyone in the neighborhood could enjoy the lake view more comfortably. It would really boost community spirit." I explained gently that while I understood her perspective, this was private lakefront property according to my deed, and I had specifically bought this house because I wanted to maintain a quiet, peaceful space. My response clearly wasn't what Debbie wanted to hear, because her face reddened slightly, though she maintained that bright, artificial smile. "Oh, privacy," she said with a little laugh that sounded forced. "Well, here in Willow Creek Ranch, we live like one big family, Mr. Graham. Community spirit is very important to us longtime residents." As she spoke, she pulled out her measuring tape and began measuring the distance from my fence to the shoreline, muttering under her breath, 50 feet of lakefront. That's quite a lot for one person to keep to themselves." I felt increasingly uncomfortable and asked directly, "What exactly are you doing with that measuring tape?" She looked up with that cold smile and replied, "Just checking things out, doing a little community assessment. Sometimes the paperwork doesn't reflect the true spirit of community cooperation." Her tone carried an unmistakable hint of threat beneath the surface pleasantries. At the end of our conversation, Debbie spoke in a sweet voice that somehow managed to sound menacing. "I'm sure we'll come to understand each other very soon, Mr. Graham. This community has its own special ways of handling situations when new residents need guidance." I watched her walk away, that bright yellow dress swaying as she made notes on her clipboard, and I had the sinking feeling that my peaceful lakefront paradise was about to become much more complicated. The next morning I discovered that someone had planted wooden stakes along my lakefront fence line during the night, as if marking out new boundaries that I certainly hadn't authorized. 2 days after Debbie's unsettling visit, I woke up to the sound of hammering and power tools coming from my lakefront, which was definitely not how I'd planned to start my peaceful morning. Looking out my bedroom window, I was shocked to see a young man energetically setting up what looked like a small wooden structure right at my property line, with construction materials scattered around. I quickly got dressed and went outside to investigate what was happening on the border between my property and the adjacent lot. The young man turned out to be Troy Langford, a cocky guy in his late 20s who was setting up a semi-permanent tent frame with obvious confidence that this was perfectly acceptable behavior. "Hey there, neighbor," Troy called out cheerfully, as if we were old friends and there was nothing unusual about him constructing buildings next to my property. "I'm Troy, Debbie's nephew, just setting up a little cabin here for a business venture I'm starting." I looked around and realized that while the tent cabin itself was positioned on his side of the property line, the path he was creating from his structure to the lake clearly crossed onto my land without any permission or easement. I pointed this out politely. "I'm sorry, but that pathway goes directly through my land, and I didn't give permission for that." Troy just laughed like I'd made some kind of joke. "Oh, Debbie said it wouldn't be a problem. She explained that this whole lakefront area is basically community space that everyone shares." "But this is my private lakefront according to all the legal documents I have," I explained, trying to keep things reasonable and neighborly. Troy grinned and showed me his rental listing. Lakefront Retreat. $200 a night. 3 bookings already. He was obviously proud of his entrepreneurial effort as he scrolled through photos that prominently featured the lake view. "I just posted this yesterday and people are really excited about having their own private lake experience." I felt my blood pressure starting to rise as the full scope of what was happening became clear. "You can't run a commercial business using my property for access." Troy was completely dismissive. "Look, man, I'm not running a business on your land. I'm running it on my land. I just need guests to walk across a tiny bit of your property to reach the water. It's not like I'm hurting anything." That's precisely when Debbie appeared, as if she'd been waiting nearby for this exact moment, wearing pink athletic clothes and carrying that same thick clipboard I'd seen during her previous visit. "Is there some kind of problem here, boys?" she asked with fake concern, acting like she had no idea what might be causing tension between us. I explained the entire situation calmly, pointing out that Troy's business plan required his paying customers to trespass on my private property to access the lake, and that I hadn't given any kind of permission for commercial use of my land. Debbie listened with that same artificial smile, and then shook her head as if I were the one who was confused about the situation. "Oh my, there seems to be a misunderstanding about how things work in our community. The HOA has already reviewed and approved this pathway arrangement for Troy." She handed me a faded, clearly unofficial community map claiming the path was communal. I examined the paper, and it was obviously hand-drawn, with no official seals, signatures, or any indication that it had been reviewed by actual authorities. "This isn't an official document," I protested, pointing out the obvious problems with what she was trying to pass off as legitimate authorization. Debbie responded with bureaucratic confidence. "The HOA has full authority to make adjustments to community access arrangements for the benefit of all residents. You're new to our community, so you don't understand all the community guidelines we've established over the years." Troy jumped in to support his aunt's position, and the best part is, I'm planning to share some of the revenue with the community fund. It's totally a win-win situation for everyone involved. Debbie nodded approvingly. "Exactly right. Troy is creating valuable economic opportunity for our entire area. Very progressive thinking that benefits the whole community." I took a deep breath and tried one more time to explain the legal reality. "I have clear property deeds and survey documents that show this lakefront belongs entirely to me. There's no community access right mentioned anywhere in the official paperwork." Debbie waved her hand dismissively, as if legal documents were just minor details. "Well, paperwork is really just a starting point for how communities actually function. Community harmony and cooperation are what really matter in the long run. You don't want to be the kind of neighbor who makes everyone else uncomfortable just because of some technical property line issues, do you?" Just as I was trying to figure out how to respond to this outrageous logic, a family of 4 with rolling suitcases and beach equipment appeared at the end of the driveway, clearly Troy's first paying customers, arriving for their luxury lakefront experience. The father approached me directly, assuming I was part of the rental operation. "Excuse me, where's the dock that's included with our rental?" I stood there, absolutely speechless, watching strangers treat my private lakefront property like it was a commercial resort that they'd paid to access. Troy quickly intervened before I could respond. "The dock access is right over there." He pointed directly toward my handmade wooden dock. "That's a shared community facility that all guests can use." I exploded. "Shared?" Debbie immediately stepped in to smooth things over before the situation could escalate further. "Of course it's shared. Community lakefront areas naturally have shared amenities for everyone to enjoy. That's the true spirit of Montana hospitality and community cooperation." The guest family smiled appreciatively and began unloading their vacation gear, setting up chairs and beach equipment on my lakefront as if it were their personal resort space that they'd legitimately rented for the weekend. I watched in complete disbelief as total strangers made themselves completely at home on my private property, while Troy and Debbie acted like this was the most natural thing in the world. The situation felt surreal, like I was trapped in some kind of property rights nightmare where strangers were partying on my land while I was expected to just accept it as normal community behavior. Later that afternoon, when I finally managed to process what had happened and check my mailbox, I found an official-looking HOA violation notice waiting for me. Unpermitted dock structure and unapproved fencing modifications, along with a fine notice for $500 and a deadline for compliance with community standards that I'd apparently violated simply by building a dock on my own property. I spent that entire night lying awake, listening to Troy's rental customers, enjoying what they thought was their private lakefront retreat, with voices carrying across the water as they talked and laughed until well past 11 p.m., completely destroying the peaceful atmosphere I'd paid good money to secure. By morning, I was exhausted and frustrated, but I'd also made a decision that it was time to stop being the passive victim and start taking action to protect what was legally mine. I decided to do thorough research into exactly what rights I had, so I spent the morning carefully reviewing all my house purchase documents, survey reports, and property deeds. Reading through every single line of legal text, I discovered something extremely interesting that I'd overlooked. I didn't just own 50 feet of shoreline property, I also had exclusive water rights that extended 20 feet out into the middle of the lake itself. This exclusive zone created what was essentially a private lane cutting directly through the water, which had major implications for Troy's business model because his guests couldn't actually reach the deeper, swimmable part of the lake without crossing through my exclusive water zone. The shallow water near shore was fine for wading, but anyone who wanted to swim or kayak would have to pass through the section that belonged exclusively to me. I found myself smiling for the first time in days because I realized that two people could definitely play this game of creative property interpretation. I immediately called my construction buddy Mike and explained that I needed materials for building a floating platform as quickly as possible. Within 4 hours, we'd installed a small but sturdy wooden platform positioned exactly in the center of my exclusive water zone, complete with barriers on both sides and a locking gate. I set up a professional-looking sign that read, Park Water Zone 10 $, crossing fee, property rights enforcement area. Below that, I added a smaller sign with a touch of humor, a HOA to misassigned access rights. I monetized the situation. The setup was perfectly legal according to my property rights, and it sent a clear message that if people wanted to treat my property like a business opportunity, I could play that game too. That same afternoon, Troy's weekend rental guests decided they wanted to take their inflatable kayaks out to the deeper part of the lake for some serious paddling and swimming. They launched their kayaks from the shoreline and paddled directly toward my floating platform where they were stopped by the barrier. "Excuse me," the father called out across the water, clearly confused. "We can't get through this barrier. Is there some kind of problem?" I walked out onto my dock carrying a small cash box and explained in my most professional voice, "This is a private water zone with exclusive access rights. There's a $10 per person crossing fee to pass through this area." The mother was absolutely shocked. "What? You can't charge us money to use a public lake?" I explained calmly. "I'm not charging anyone for general lake use. I'm charging a fee to cross through my exclusive water zone, which is perfectly legal. It's the same principle as Troy charging you $200 per night to use lakefront property that actually belongs to me." The family was furious and paddled back toward shore, arguing loudly among themselves about false advertising. They immediately started complaining to Troy, who came storming over with obvious panic about his business. "Dude, what the hell do you think you're doing? You can't just set up some kind of toll booth on a public lake." I sat down comfortably on my dock, keeping the cash box visible. "Actually, I can do exactly that. Your Aunt Debbie said the community can reassign property rights whenever it benefits everyone. Well, I've decided this arrangement benefits me." Troy immediately pulled out his phone to call for backup, and within 10 minutes, Debbie arrived with her face already red from anger. "Eli, this is completely outrageous. You're basically extorting innocent tourists." I maintained my composure. "I'm not extorting anyone. I'm charging a reasonable fee for crossing through my exclusive water zone, just like Troy charges tourists for lakefront access using my property without permission." Debbie pulled out that same hand-drawn community map and waved it around. "The HOA has full authority over water access arrangements." I pulled out my official property deed. "Private water rights that are recorded with the county supersede any HOA authority. Would you like to see the official survey? Right at that moment, Troy's second set of rental customers arrived. A middle-aged couple with an inflatable boat who immediately ran into the same barrier. "What's going on here?" they called out, looking confused. Troy was embarrassed. There's just a small access fee situation." But the wife exploded. "Access fee? Your listing promised unlimited lake access." I decided to be helpful. Troy's listing includes several creative interpretations. The second family immediately began arguing with Troy about false advertising and demanding refunds. While all this drama was unfolding, another rental guest started live streaming the entire chaotic scene, adding commentary about vacation rental scams. The video quickly started getting shared with captions like, "Rental scam alert, fake lake access." Comments began flooding in, and surprisingly, most were supporting my position. Debbie was getting increasingly desperate. "Fine, the HOA will pay the access fees for legitimate community members." I grinned. "That's very generous. The fee for both families, 4 people each, round trip, would be $200 total." The video was rapidly going viral, with hashtags about rental scams and property rights battles, with the comment section overwhelmingly supportive of my position. As the sun set, Debbie approached me privately and whispered with pure menace, "This is just the beginning. I'm going to make your life absolutely miserable until you learn how things work here." Troy's rental disaster spread across social media like wildfire, with videos of the lake toll booth getting shared throughout local community groups and reaching people far beyond our subdivision in Montana. The reviews from Troy's weekend customers were absolutely devastating to his business reputation. Completely false advertising, hidden fees and property disputes, vacation nightmare, avoid at all costs. Troy's rental rating plummeted from 5 stars to less than 2 stars almost overnight, and Debbie was clearly panicking as she watched her nephew's business venture collapse in real time. In what I can only describe as a desperate attempt at damage control, Debbie decided to contact the local newspaper, the Willow Creek Gazette, to arrange what she probably thought would be a sympathetic interview that would expose me as a troublemaking outsider who was destroying peaceful community harmony through selfish and unreasonable behavior. Debbie arrived with stacks of papers and that same self-righteous energy I'd come to recognize. Reporter Jenny Walsh arrived with her cameraman, probably expecting to cover a simple human interest story about a typical neighbor dispute that could be resolved with a little community goodwill and compromise. The interview started exactly as Debbie had planned, with Jenny asking basic questions about the situation and Debbie launching into what was clearly a well-rehearsed speech designed to paint me as the villain in this whole drama. Eli Graham moved into our peaceful community and immediately started causing problems for everyone. Debbie began with the kind of righteous indignation that suggested she truly believed her own version of events, absolutely refuses to share the beautiful lakefront with his neighbors. And then, he escalated the situation by setting up an illegal toll booth on public water, basically extorting innocent tourists who just wanted to enjoy nature. Jenny was taking notes and nodding along, asking follow-up questions about the property ownership situation. "And what's the legal status of the lakefront ownership?" she inquired. Debbie's response revealed the fundamental weakness in her position. "Well, technically speaking, Eli does own the land, according to the paperwork, but lakefront access has been used by community members for many years before he arrived. We have long-standing traditions and informal agreements that should be respected." That's when I decided it was time to present my side of the story, and I appeared with an organized folder containing all my legal documents, survey maps, and evidence that I'd carefully prepared for exactly this kind of situation. "May I respond to those claims?" I asked politely, and Jenny immediately turned her camera toward me with obvious interest in hearing both sides of the controversy. I calmly and systematically presented my evidence. Official property deeds that clearly showed my ownership, professional survey maps that detailed exact boundaries, photographs documenting Troy's unauthorized construction on my property, and screenshots of his rental listing that explicitly advertised private lake access that he had no legal right to offer. "The real issue here isn't community lake use by neighbors," I explained clearly. "The issue is commercial exploitation of my private property without permission. Troy has been using my lakefront to advertise his luxury lakefront retreat business, charging tourists $200 per night for access to property he doesn't own, and then expecting me to provide free access across my land for his paying customers." Jenny was clearly intrigued by this perspective and asked, "So this conflict started because of a commercial rental business operation?" Before I could respond, Debbie quickly interrupted with obvious desperation. It's really about community sharing and cooperation. Troy was just trying to contribute to the local economy and bring some tourism revenue to our area. I was ready for that response and pulled out printed copies of the online reviews from Troy's disappointed customers. Let me read you some quotes about how this community sharing approach actually worked out. Completely false advertising about property access, hidden fees and unexpected costs. Property boundary disputes ruined our vacation. Host couldn't deliver what was promised in listing. These customers feel scammed because they paid for services that Troy had no legal right to provide. The camera was capturing Debbie's face as it grew redder with each review I read, and it was obvious that the interview wasn't going according to her carefully planned script. Jenny then asked the kind of direct question that cut right to the heart of the matter. Mrs. Langford, what specific legal authority does the HOA have over privately owned lakefront property? Jenny pressed further, but HOA regulations cannot override recorded property deeds, correct? Debbie stammered, well, yes, but we've always done it this way. When Jenny pressed her with follow-up questions about documented legal authority, Debbie completely lost her composure and exploded with the truth. I've been managing this community for 8 years. I'm the one who decides what's best for everyone, and I know what this community needs better than some outsider who just moved here. That outburst was exactly what I needed, and I seized the moment. There it is, exactly what I've been saying. This isn't about community decision-making or democratic processes. This is about one person unilaterally deciding to give away my property rights to benefit her nephew's commercial business venture. Jenny turned toward the neighborhood where several curious residents had gathered, attracted by the presence of the camera crew and interested in what was being said about their community. What do you residents think about this situation? She asked an elderly woman who'd been listening to the entire exchange. The woman's response was probably not what Debbie had been hoping for. To be completely honest, I never really wanted strangers camping and partying in my backyard every weekend. But Debbie told all of us that supporting Troy's business was a mandatory part of community spirit, and that anyone who objected was being selfish and uncooperative. Another neighbor chimed in with his own perspective. I actually thought the lake belonged to all of us equally as community property. I had no idea it was Eli's private property that was being used for commercial purposes without his permission. Debbie's face had progressed from red to purple as she watched her community support evaporating in real time, and she made one final desperate attempt to control the narrative. These people don't understand the bigger picture of community values and cooperative living. Jenny concluded the interview with what became a devastating soundbite that would be replayed multiple times. So just to be clear, you gave permission for commercial use of private property without getting consent from the actual property owner? Debbie shouted, "Yes!" before she realized what she'd just admitted on camera, and the livestream comments section exploded with reactions. HOA Karen totally exposed. She literally just confessed to the whole thing. Team Eli all the way. This is why people hate HOAs. After the camera crew finished packing up and left, Debbie cornered me with the kind of fury that suggested she blamed me personally for the complete destruction of her public image. You think you've won some kind of victory here, but I'm just getting started with you. I'll make your life absolutely hell through code violations, noise complaints, harassment charges, and whatever else it takes to force you out of this community. Troy approached us, clearly panicking about the complete collapse of his business. Aunt Debbie, my rental rating is completely destroyed. All my upcoming bookings are getting canceled, and former customers are demanding full refunds plus compensation for their ruined vacations. Debbie snapped at her nephew with vicious anger. Shut up. This situation is much bigger than your stupid little business venture now. The next morning, I discovered that Debbie had filed an official police report, claiming that I had threatened both her and Troy with violence. And she'd also submitted a formal petition to the HOA board requesting that my membership be terminated. The news story about our property dispute aired on the local television station and completely backfired on Debbie in ways she obviously hadn't anticipated when she'd arranged the interview. Instead of generating sympathy for her position, the broadcast actually caused the local community to rally behind me, as people began to understand that they'd been manipulated and lied to about the true nature of the conflict. Troy's rental business didn't just suffer, it collapsed completely and catastrophically. With zero new bookings, increasingly terrible online reviews, and a growing list of former customers demanding refunds for what they now understood had been fraudulent advertising about property access rights that didn't exist. But Debbie wasn't ready to surrender or admit defeat, and she escalated the conflict by filing a false police report that claimed I had threatened her and Troy with physical violence during our previous confrontations. I realized that pursuing this through normal legal channels would probably take many months of expensive lawyer fees and court appearances, while my peace and quiet continued to be destroyed by the ongoing drama and conflict that seemed to be consuming more of my time and energy every day. It was time for direct action that would resolve the situation quickly and definitively, so I called my construction friend Mike with a specific request. I need fence posts installed today, running the exact property line from my house straight down to the lake shore. Mike understood exactly what I was trying to accomplish and arrived within an hour with a truck full of materials and the equipment needed to complete the job quickly. Working together, we installed sturdy wooden fence posts every 10 feet along the entire property line, connecting them with strong wire fencing that clearly delineated the boundary. The fence line ran from my house, cut directly through the middle of Troy's outdoor business setup, and terminated at the lakefront water's edge. We were mathematically precise about following the official property survey, making sure every post was positioned exactly on the legal boundary line. The result was ridiculous, his entire setup now awkwardly sliced by the new fence. His barbecue area was split, outdoor furniture scattered between properties, and his pathway to the lake completely blocked by the legal boundary that had always existed, but was now impossible to ignore. Troy discovered our construction project about halfway through the installation process and came running over with obvious panic. "What the hell do you think you're doing? You can't just build a fence through the middle of my business setup." I continued working while I replied calmly, "I'm marking my exact property line according to the official survey. This fence follows the precise legal boundary between my property and yours." Troy was practically shouting at this point, "You can't fence through my barbecue area and customer space. This is going to destroy my business." I pointed to the survey stakes that the county had placed to mark official boundaries and explained, "Your business setup is positioned on my property without permission. This fence simply makes the legal reality visible to everyone." Debbie arrived on the scene like a force of nature, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Eli, this is absolutely insane! You're destroying community harmony and cooperation. This is the most petty, vindictive thing I've ever seen." I straightened up from my work and looked her directly in the eye. "No, Debbie, I'm not destroying anything. I'm defining property boundaries clearly, so there can't be any more confusion or misunderstandings. This side of the fence is mine, that side is yours. No more ambiguity about who owns what." The fence construction was attracting curious neighbors from throughout the subdivision, and their reactions ranged from amusement to amazement at the visual impact of seeing property lines actually marked. Debbie was becoming increasingly desperate as she watched the community reaction, which wasn't the outrage and support for her position that she'd obviously expected. "This is petty and vindictive behavior. You're acting like a spoiled child who can't share his toys." I maintained my calm, professional demeanor. "I'm acting like a property owner who's defending his legal rights. The survey documentation doesn't lie, and neither does this fence." Troy was panicking about the immediate practical implications for his already failing business. What about my remaining rental bookings? How are guests supposed to access the lake area now? I gave him a straightforward answer. "They're not going to access the lake through my property. If you want to offer lake access, you'll need to find a legal way to do it that doesn't involve trespassing." Debbie tried a different approach, appealing to abstract community values. Community cooperation and sharing are more important than arbitrary property lines drawn on old maps. I had a simple response for that argument. If community ownership is so important to you, then purchase the property at fair market value. Until then, you need to respect the legal boundaries that exist. The completion of the fence caused immediate chaos for Troy's operation. His outdoor furniture was now split between two properties, his pathway to the lake was completely blocked, and his remaining rental guests were confused and angry about the sudden change in their promised accommodations. One guest approached me directly. "Can we still use the lake area for swimming and kayaking?" I was helpful and polite. "Absolutely, you can use the lake itself, just not through private property. The public access point is around the other side of the lake, about a half-mile walk through the woods." Troy stood there speechless, watching his business model completely collapse in real time. Debbie made one final threat that revealed her desperation. I'm calling the county inspector, the police, the state authorities, and anyone else who will listen. This fence is illegal and I'll have it removed. I was prepared for that response and pulled out the permits that Mike had helped me obtain. Everything is completely legal and properly permitted. Installing a fence on your own property line doesn't require any special permissions from neighbors or HOA boards. It's a fundamental property owner's right. The crowd of neighbors gradually dispersed, with several people approaching me privately to apologize for initially supporting Debbie's scheme, admitting that they hadn't understood the true nature of the property ownership dispute. That night, I was awakened by suspicious sounds coming from the direction of the fence, and when I checked my security camera footage the next morning, I discovered that Troy had attempted to cut through the fence wire at 2 a.m, apparently trying to restore access to the lake for his business operation. The security camera footage showing Troy attempting to sabotage my fence at 2 a.m. provided me with perfect evidence of property destruction and criminal trespassing that could have serious legal consequences for him. Troy's desperate middle-of-the-night fence cutting had failed completely because we'd used heavy-duty materials, and I was able to repair the minor damage within an hour using even stronger wire that would be impossible to cut with simple tools. But the incident gave me solid legal grounds to file official trespassing and property damage charges if I chose to pursue that route, which added another layer of pressure to an already desperate situation for Troy and Debbie. Debbie was clearly panicking as she watched Troy's rental business collapse entirely while he potentially faced criminal charges. So she decided to make one final desperate move that would either restore her authority or destroy her credibility completely. She organized what she called Community Lake Day, announcing it as a massive neighborhood gathering designed to demonstrate unified community opposition to what she characterized as my tyrannical behavior. We're taking back our community space from someone who thinks he can privatize what belongs to all of us. Debbie announced dramatically on the neighborhood's social media page, encouraging people to bring their entire families for an afternoon of picnicking, swimming, and celebrating true community values in the face of individual selfishness. Her announcement was shared widely, and on Sunday morning, more than 25 people showed up on the lakefront, making it the biggest community gathering in the subdivision's history. There were families with children, elderly couples, and even some people from neighboring areas who had heard about the property dispute drama and were curious to see how it would play out. Debbie had prepared extensively for this event, setting up a portable microphone and speaker system so she could address the crowd with what was clearly intended to be an inspiring speech about community solidarity. Friends and neighbors, she began with the kind of passionate intensity usually reserved for political rallies. We gather here today to defend our shared community values against the forces of individual greed and selfishness. One person cannot be allowed to privatize and monopolize what rightfully belongs to all of us as a community. The crowd was initially supportive, cheering enthusiastically about community rights, natural resource sharing, and standing up to unreasonable property owners who didn't understand the spirit of cooperative living. The atmosphere felt like a genuine grassroots movement, and Debbie was clearly energized by the positive response to her message. But I had prepared my own counter-strategy for exactly this kind of situation, and I was ready to present the full truth to everyone who had gathered. I appeared on my floating dock platform in the middle of the lake, positioning myself where I would be visible to the entire crowd while my voice would carry clearly across the water. I had brought a portable speaker system and my smartphone loaded with audio recordings that I'd been collecting throughout this entire conflict. "Attention, everyone!" My voice boomed across the lake, immediately getting the attention of every person on the shoreline. "Before you commit to supporting this cause, I think you should hear the complete truth about what's really been happening here." The crowd turned toward my voice with obvious curiosity, and I could see that I had their full attention for whatever I was about to reveal. I pressed play on my phone, and Debbie's own recorded voice began playing back her previous statements. "I gave Troy full lake access rights. I've been managing this community for 8 years, and I decide what's best for everyone. I've been controlling this lakefront area according to my judgment of community needs." Then Troy's voice played back his admissions. "Debbie said we could use it for the business. She told me the whole lakefront was basically community space that I could use. It's just business, and the community should support local entrepreneurs." The audio evidence created a clear pattern that revealed the lies and manipulation that had been used to justify their actions. I could see the crowd beginning to murmur among themselves as they realized they'd been given false information about the nature of the conflict. I continued with my presentation. Troy's rental business was charging tourists $200 per night for what he advertised as luxury private lakefront access, using my property without permission, and then expecting me to provide free access for his paying customers. When I objected to commercial exploitation of my private property, I was called selfish and uncooperative. When I defended my legal property rights, I was accused of destroying community harmony. I played more audio recordings, Troy arguing with disappointed customers who felt scammed, Debbie admitting that she had given permissions she had no legal authority to grant, and both of them discussing how to manipulate community opinion to support their position. This was never about community lake access or sharing natural resources, I concluded. This was about one family attempting to profit financially from property they don't own, while using community rhetoric to manipulate neighbors into supporting their scheme. The crowd's mood was shifting dramatically as the full scope of the deception became clear, and I could see several families beginning to pack up their picnic supplies with embarrassed expressions on their faces. Others remained but stopped cheering for Debbie's speeches as they processed the implications of what they'd just heard. Troy, watching his public support completely evaporate, made the mistake of confronting his aunt publicly about the failure of her strategies. "This is all your fault, Aunt Debbie. You promised me that nobody would ever find out the truth, and now my business is completely ruined." Debbie hissed back, "Shut up and don't say another word." But the microphone system picked up their argument and broadcast it to the entire gathering. Their family conflict escalated into a public shouting match that revealed even more about their true motivations. Troy yelled, "You ruined everything. I had a steady income coming from those rentals, and now I'm facing criminal charges." Debbie responded with, "You're an idiot who couldn't keep quiet. You should have been more subtle about the whole operation." Troy shot back, "More subtle? You literally announced on social media that you personally controlled the entire lake area. How was I supposed to be subtle when you were broadcasting our plans to everyone?" The crowd was now fully aware of the family dynamics at play. A greedy nephew and his controlling aunt who had conspired together to steal a neighbor's property for commercial profit, while manipulating the community into supporting their scheme. An elderly neighbor who had been listening to everything approached the microphone set up and addressed Debbie directly. "I feel completely deceived and manipulated. You told all of us that supporting Troy was a community obligation and that anyone who objected was being selfish. But now I understand it was just a family business scheme that benefited you personally." Other neighbors began voicing similar complaints about being lied to and used, and Debbie's authority was crumbling publicly in real time. In a final act of desperation, Debbie rushed toward my dock to confront me directly, but the wooden dock was wet from morning dew, and in her emotional state, she wasn't paying attention to where she was stepping. She slipped on the wet boards and fell backward into the lake with a huge splash that sent water flying everywhere. The crowd gasped at first, then several people started laughing at the absurd spectacle of the HOA chairwoman falling into the very lake she'd been claiming to control. Someone in the crowd shouted, "There goes the HOA chair into the lake she doesn't even own." Multiple people were recording the incident on their phones, and within minutes the video was being uploaded to social media with captions like, "Karen falls into lake during property rights battle," and "HOA chair gets dunked." Debbie emerged from the water completely soaked, her dignity destroyed, mascara running down her face and her dress clinging to her body in the most unflattering way possible. She tried desperately to maintain some authority. "This isn't over. I'll find other ways to deal with this situation." But the crowd was already dispersing, with some people helping the soaked Debbie while others were still chuckling about what they'd just witnessed. Troy quietly began packing up his remaining belongings, muttering under his breath about needing to find a new location and a different business model, while the video of Debbie's lake plunge was already going viral with #LakeKaren, transforming her into a regional internet meme and forcing her to resign from her HOA leadership position within the week. Debbie's fall into the lake went viral, appearing in national meltdown compilations with millions of views. Most reactions supported me as a reasonable property owner standing up to HOA abuse. News outlets picked up the story, calling it a David v. Goliath case about property rights gone wrong. I handled all the media attention as gracefully as possible, consistently focusing on the underlying principles rather than making personal attacks against Debbie or Troy, always emphasizing that this had been about protecting legal property rights, rather than seeking revenge or humiliation. I moved to Montana because I wanted peace and quiet, where I could run my boat repair business without interference, I explained to one television reporter. When someone tries to steal your property for their commercial profit while manipulating the community into supporting their scheme, you have not just the right but the obligation to defend what's legally yours. Debbie, thoroughly embarrassed by her viral internet fame and facing widespread community backlash, quietly resigned from her HOA chairwoman position and began spending most of her time indoors, avoiding eye contact with neighbors, and clearly hoping that public attention would eventually move on to other stories. Troy packed up his belongings completely, abandoned his failed rental venture, and left town entirely to start over somewhere else where his reputation hadn't been destroyed by false advertising complaints and property dispute drama. The empty cabin where he'd tried to run his lakefront business sat unused for several months, with weeds gradually reclaiming the space where his commercial operation had briefly existed. New HOA leadership was democratically elected by the community, with the elderly neighbor who had spoken up during the confrontation becoming the new president, with a mandate to focus on actual community needs like road maintenance, trash collection, and utility issues rather than attempting to control individual property usage. The new leadership approach was much more respectful of property rights and personal autonomy, creating a healthier dynamic throughout the entire subdivision. Having successfully made my point about property boundaries and rights, I decided to demonstrate that victory didn't require ongoing vindictiveness or punishment of my former opponents. I modified the fence design to include a small gate section that would allow respectful neighbors occasional access for quiet fishing or peaceful lake appreciation, but only with advance permission and clear understanding that this was a privilege rather than a right. I completely removed the lake toll booth system since its purpose had been served and it was no longer needed to make the point about property rights and commercial exploitation. However, I kept all the boundary markers clearly visible and well maintained to ensure that future misunderstandings about property lines would be impossible. The process of community healing began as neighbors who had initially supported Debbie's position approached me with genuine apologies, admitting that they hadn't understood the true nature of the property ownership dispute and had been manipulated by misleading information about community rights and sharing obligations. "We were wrong about you. You were just protecting what's yours," one neighbor explained with obvious embarrassment. I was gracious in accepting these apologies. There are no hard feelings about any of this. The important thing is that we all learned something valuable. Clear boundaries and honest communication create much better neighborhoods than manipulation and false promises. Property values throughout the subdivision actually increased over the following months as potential buyers appreciated the clear resolution of boundary disputes and the establishment of a more respectful community leadership structure. Real estate agents began using my situation as a positive example of well-defined property rights and community conflict resolution, pointing out to prospective buyers that they would know exactly what they were purchasing and what their rights and responsibilities would be. My boat repair business expanded significantly as word spread throughout the region about my expertise and the integrity I had demonstrated during the property dispute, with customers appreciating that they were dealing with someone who stood behind his principles even when facing community pressure. I established weekend fishing lessons for local children as an appropriate use of my lakefront that brought positive community benefits without commercial exploitation or property rights violations. These sessions became popular throughout the area, teaching kids about water safety, conservation, and respect for private property, while giving them supervised access to quality fishing opportunities. I also began hosting occasional barbecues with immediate neighbors who had developed genuine friendships based on mutual respect and clear understanding of boundaries, rather than the manipulation and false promises that had characterized the previous community dynamics. 6 months after the fence construction and property rights battle, Willow Creek Ranch subdivision had transformed into a much more peaceful and harmonious place to live. There was no more commercial exploitation of residential property, no more boundary disputes causing ongoing drama, and no more HOA overreach attempting to control individual property usage for personal benefit. Debbie made one final attempt at reconciliation before she moved away from the area entirely, approaching me with what seemed like genuine regret. I suppose I was a bit too controlling about community affairs. Maybe I should have minded my own business. I responded diplomatically, "We all learned valuable lessons from this situation. Water under the bridge, or in your case, water over the head." I was pleased that we could end our conflict with a moment of shared humor rather than ongoing bitterness. Troy never returned to the area, but he did send a brief apologetic text message acknowledging that his business model had been fundamentally wrong and that he should have obtained proper permissions before using other people's property for commercial purposes. New residents moving into the subdivision appreciated the clear expectations and resolved conflicts that characterized the community, knowing exactly what they were purchasing and what the established standards were for property usage and neighbor relationships. In my final reflection on the entire experience, sitting on my dock at sunrise with a cup of coffee, watching the peaceful lake reflect the morning light while the fence posts stood as quiet reminders of successfully defended boundaries, I realized that sometimes you don't need expensive lawyers or lengthy court battles to resolve property disputes. Sometimes you just need a fence and the courage to defend it.